Good morning, everyone. It is good to see everyone here this morning, and it's good to have such a nice day and on which to worship God. What a blessing, and good to see some visitors here this morning, and very thankful that you've come to join us today. I want to start off, though, by thanking the members here and thanking especially the sisters here for the wonderful baby shower that you all threw my wife yesterday. That was very kind, and I really appreciated all the things that you provided us. Very, very thankful that there were no loud, noisy electric toys. That's very good. We were hoping to avoid those altogether, and we're thankful that you all were on the same page with us about that. We got everything really in the manner of which are the things that we wanted, and so we're very thankful for you and for all that you gave and for all that you've done for us since we've been here. It's going to be a really pleasant time for us. It already has been, and you all really helping to make that possible. We're going through the book of Nehemiah, and we have been examining some various principles, ways that we can govern our lives, taken from the lessons that we see in the chapters of this book. And Nehemiah is an Old Testament book, and if you're not familiar with us or you're visiting with us, this is a book that records the rebuilding of the wall of a city called Jerusalem. The wall of Jerusalem has been destroyed, but the man, Nehemiah, who authored this book, I believe, he is recounting how he took it upon himself under the guidance and under the care of God to rebuild the walls of this city, knowing that at this time and in this day, this was a city in which God's people lived, and it was a city that should have therefore given glory to God. And we realize that today God's city is a heavenly one. God's Jerusalem is basically the church, and it's a place that rather a people rather than a place, and that we all can be a part of that heavenly city, that heavenly Jerusalem. But at the same time, we all have to govern our lives by certain qualities or characteristics that are found in the pages of the Bible. Nehemiah can actually help us in that. Stone of conversation, I want to begin with a little illustration from a classroom setting. I'm a teacher, and so we can appreciate some of these things, but I don't teach the little kids anymore. It's been a while since I've done that. There was a teacher, though, that was standing in front of a primary grade classroom and said before her students, fill in the blank for me. Cleanliness is next to... Now, we usually say godliness, but one of the children there rather raised his hand, and he said, cleanliness is next to impossible. Next to impossible. Very hard to be cleanly. I kind of feel like that sometimes. I'm not the neat one in our family, and so can feel like that sometimes, but I'm not talking as I think about that statement. I think that it says more than meets the eye, because as we think about the world in which we live, it can be actually very, very hard to live a morally pure life. It can be very hard to live in an outstanding and an upright way. And you might think sometimes that moral cleanliness, not physical cleanliness, but moral cleanliness is next to impossible. And you might think that there are so many negative influences and so many misdirections that we can take in our lives. Well, as we think about these things, realize it is possible. What a wonderful example we have in the man Noah. You know, if ever there was a time when children could have came home, Ham, Shem, and Japheth could have came home and said, everybody's doing it, then it would have been during the time of Noah. It was a time in which people did that which was right in their own eyes, and people were not living faithful to God. And yet the Bible says that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He did what was right. He was able to stand against almost, obviously, the entire world, and it was the entire world except for his family, in standing and serving God. We don't face those kind of odds today. It is possible to live morally right, to live morally pure. Nehemiah chapter 5 is a chapter in which the Jews came face to face with this need based upon some problems that were happening among them. We've read verses 1 through 5 just a moment ago, and if you didn't catch quite what was happening there, let me summarize it for you. Basically, you have the Jews who are enduring a famine or a dearth, as the King James Bible puts it. They're having to borrow money based upon their houses, their lands, and even future crops to try to pay for their taxes, to try to pay for the food that they eat. Some of them are even borrowing money to pay their taxes on the land that they own, and so they're borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. Now, the question is, wherever there's a borrower, there's a lender. So the question is, who's the lender? Who's the one who's lending out this money? And in actuality, it is the rich Jews who are lending money to their poor Jewish brethren. And so these poor Jewish brethren are suffering. They are starving. And yet there are these rich brethren who are making profit off of them and are even claiming their lands. And if you look at the reading there again, even claiming their sons and their daughters. This was a time in which people, when they got into really dire straits, they would actually give their children over to be slaves in someone else's household. And this was happening. And not among worldly people, it was happening among God's own people. They were making profit off of their brethren, and they were taking their brethren's children as slaves. What a terrible situation, and what an inconsistent situation with people who are supposed to be God's children. Well, if they're going to do something as great as building the wall of Jerusalem, they're going to have to take care of these inconsistent behaviors. And that's what Nehemiah chapter 5 is all about. Nehemiah needed to restore the stone of conversation. Now, as we get into this word conversation, we're going to examine it as we have the other terms, and we realize that conversation is a word that we don't use in the same way that I'm using it this morning typically. When we think about conversation, what do we think about? We think about two people talking, right? Well, that's not the way I'm using the word today. I'm actually using an older meaning of the word conversation, not two people talking. But instead, if you study one of the older translations of the Bible, which I do use, the King James, you see this word conversation cropping up a number of times. And generally what it means is what it meant back in the 1800s. This is the Webster's Dictionary definition of conversation as it meant in the 1800s. The general course of manners, behavior, deportment. We don't use that word at all today, but especially as it respects morals. And I got into the habit in my King James Bible, whenever I see that word conversation, knowing that that's usually what it means, I got into the habit of simply reading manner of life, the way that you live, all right, the way that you live. Now, that does help in understanding, but it actually simplifies it a bit too much. Conversation is a word that in English is encapsulating a lot of diverse ideas. And whereas in the English you only have this word conversation, there are actually several words that lie behind the text that we read in our English Bibles. I want to have a look at these different words, and not because I'm a great scholar on these kind of things, but because each of them gives a little bit of a shade of meaning that is a little bit different and helps us to fully appreciate what we're talking about. Now, we're not going to be writing down these, we're not going to be examining these scripture references, but I do encourage you to write them down. And you can have a look at them later and examine them in more detail. In the Hebrew Bible, or in other words, in the Old Testament scriptures, you have basically only one word for the word conversation, just as we only have that one English word to describe a manner of life. The word is derek, and it's found, for example, in Psalm 50 and verse 23, which again, we won't be examining, but you can write it down to do your own word study on this later. The word, as it is found there, it means a road, actually, that you walked on, a course of life. And so it could refer to a literal road, or it could refer to, just the way that you go about living your life. What road are you on? What path are you on? And people could be seen as being on a sort of path. Generally speaking, we do kind of the same things over and over again to the point where it becomes a path or a direction. Decisions become a direction. Directions lead, of course, always to destinations. And so we have a path. Where are we headed? And God's people have always been called to have their way ordered after God's path or God's pattern. Now, in the New Testament, this word conversation is a lot richer. There are actually 3 words that exist behind that one English word in the Old King James, conversation. The 3 Greek words are, first of all, anastrophe. Anastrophe means basically it actually is a word that describes a change in the way that you've lived your life. You're not on a path that you were previously on. Your conversation has become something different. You're living differently. All right, the second word that you find is the word politumai. Now, you might be tempted to see in that word polite. That's actually not what it is, but it's actually more like our word for politics. Politics. All right, now that word politics, even though politicians rarely act this way, the word actually refers to those who are bound by a law. And so the manner of life in which one demonstrates that he is bound by a law. All right. A third definition is tropos in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. And this simply means a way or direction, a fashion or a manner of life. That's the most similar probably to that Hebrew word in the Old Testament. Now, again, we're not doing this just for pure intellectual stimulation. I want you to think about those 4 definitions now, and we're going to stack them against some probably soul-searching questions for us as we think about this concept and whether or not it really is in practice in our lives. To summarize those 4 definitions, again, you have a road you walk upon, a change of life, you're bound by the law, and it's a fashion of life. It's the way that you live. As you think about those 4 definitions, those 4 words that are summed up by conversation, ask yourself some questions. First of all, the road that you walk on. Can people tell that you live by a pattern? Can they see in your life a direction? You've probably met that person before that lives their lives, and they're what people sometimes refer to as kind of that fly-by-night, carefree personality, she'll be right night kind of thing. You know, you just do this, do that, and not really seemingly plotting any kind of course, just living, just existing, not getting anywhere. Well, Christians shouldn't be like that. You know, we should be living a life that people can see and see a difference and see where we're going. Can they see it in us? Can they see that our goal is heaven? Can they see that our goal is pleasing God? Change of life is implied by the idea of conversation. Can anyone see a difference in us? It's wonderful when you have this experience of having not been a Christian and having been a Christian from only one standpoint. Obviously, there are many things we regret in our past, but it gives us a sort of test. You know, when we go to those people who knew us before we became a Christian, and we go to those same people after we've become a Christian, we can ask them a question. Do you see a change in me? Am I any different? And they should see a change in us. There should be a marked difference in us. When we became a Christian, how we live our life should be different than the way that we used to live our life. Well, can people see the change? You think about being one that is bound by a law. Do people see that you were bound by Christ's law? Do they see a higher law at work in your life? Or are you a person who is basically, when there's enough pressure, you'll cave in? Faith is supposed to be a conviction. Is your faith a conviction? Or do you find yourself constantly giving in to your schoolmates' demands or your boss's demands or whoever might be placing demands on your life? You see, fashion of life there as a definition. Can the world see your love? Can they see the way that you govern your life, your love for Christ, and can they see your love for His church? By all this shall all men know that you are my disciples, by the love that you have one for another. Can people see that this really is your family, this spiritual body is your family? Can they see the love existing in this family? And can they see that it's obviously something different than what you were before? Is your fashion of life transformed as you follow Christ? Now, as we think about conversation, and we think about those definitions, and we ask ourselves some questions, I think some people don't reason properly about all of these things. And their reasoning along these lines goes something like this. Well, this is a similar illustration. If it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, you know, if it does all those things, it must be a camel in disguise, right? Must be. You know, you see all these things, all these little creatures in the water there, they're actually camels. All right? If you go up to them closely, they'll spit on you. All right? They have a lot of water stored in their backs. Actually, it's water off of a duck's back, isn't it? I don't know. Anyway, this is not right, is it? This isn't clear reasoning. It's not logical. It doesn't make sense. Well, think about it in relationship to the way that we behave sometimes. Well, you look like a duck. You dress like everybody else dresses. You walk like a duck. You do what everyone else does. You quack like a duck. You talk like the world talks. All of the obscenities, all of the swear words, all those things are a part of your speech as well. You do all those things, and therefore you must be a Christian. That doesn't make sense, does it? Conversation. A word that summarizes really the fact that we should have changed when we came to Christ. We should be something different, and it should be noticeable. We were told in Matthew 5:13 through 16 to let our salt season the world, and we were told to let our light shine before men. But that illustration, very powerful there, of the light shining before men. He says that people don't light a candle and put it under a bushel or a basket. Why? Well, because the purpose of lighting a candle is to give light. But there's another reason. What happens if you put your candle, your light, under a basket? What happens? the light will actually extinguish. The light will go out. And that's what happens to our Christianity. Every time we try to hide it, every time we try to take a step back and we cave into the world's demands, every time we go along with that friend who's trying to lead us against Christ's principles, or that boss who's trying to expect of us something that we know is morally wrong, every time that happens and every time we cave in, our light is getting that much closer to being extinguished. And the difference that Christ has made in our lives is becoming less of a difference until it's no different at all. As you think about these things, when we disguise our Christianity will fade away, just like a light that's put under a basket will also fade away. Conversation is incredibly important. As we go back to Nehemiah chapter 5 and we again see this time of famine that we spoke of in verse 3, we see that people are borrowing, even selling their children into slavery to be able to make ends meet, to be able to provide food for the rest of their family, and to be able to pay the bills, the local rulers. And these local rulers are in effect, adding to these burdens. And they're selling each other in effect into slavery. In verse 11, Nehemiah, speaking to these rulers, he says, "Restore, I pray you, to them, even this day, their lands, their vineyards, their olive yards, their houses, also the 100th part of the money," the taxes, in other words, "of the corn, the wine, the oil that you exact of them." It was they who were placing these burdens upon each other, totally inconsistent with the life that God would have them to live, of generosity and helping their brethren. The Jews, therefore, are acting no differently than the world. The Persians had enslaved the Jewish people, and the Jews were enslaving themselves. All right? Now that's conversation illustrated. But how do we see this principle at work in this chapter? We're going to show three reasons to show proper conversation and to show proper respect to God. Actually, that slide isn't right. I'm supposed to say three reasons to have a proper conversation. Sorry about that. As illustrated by Nehemiah chapter 5. First of all, to stop reproach. To stop reproach. Now, what is reproach? Reproach is when people say bad things about someone. In particular, we're trying to stop people from saying bad things about the God that we serve based upon the life that we live. The Jews were treating each other in such a way that gave their enemies, the people that we talked about in the Bible class hour, it gave them the opportunity to actually think less of them and to think less of their God. In Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 9, he said, "Also I said, it is not good that you do this. Ought you not to walk in the fear of God because of the reproach of the heathen, our enemies?" Those of you who are new to this study, that they were trying to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, but there were a lot of people who did not want to see them do it. And a lot of people trying to stop them in doing that. Not just because they were economically perhaps afraid of the city of Jerusalem being revived and the Jews once again being a people of business and trade, but also because they did not serve the God that the Jews served. And so they were against this building from the very beginning up of the walls of Jerusalem. And so when the Jews behaved like this toward each other, it caused those heathen or those non-Jewish people, it caused them to think less of the God of heaven and earth. And so Nehemiah says we can't be doing this. As we think about that, though, does our practice of Christianity sometimes give people reason to think less of the God that we serve? Now, Romans chapter 2 is not first written to us. It is written, obviously, as a part of the New Testament. I want you to go over there with me now. Just put a bookmark in Nehemiah chapter 5. It's not first written to us. Actually, the chapter is written to first century Jewish Christians. And these Jewish Christians had actually come into the church with a sort of spiritual superiority complex. They thought that they were better than the Gentile Christians because they had served God for longer and because their culture actually was to serve God, whereas the culture of the Gentiles was to serve these pagan idols that you've probably heard of, Zeus and so on. And so, Jupiter in the case of the Romans. But in Romans chapter 2, Paul actually talks with them and gets them to really do some thinking about themselves and how they've more or less set themselves up in the eyes of their Gentile brethren. They think that they're teachers. They think that they're guides. But is that really what they are? In Romans chapter 2 and verse 21, these are questions, again, first asked to them, but let's think about them for ourselves. It says, "Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself?" Don't you teach yourself before you teach someone else? And what does he call them to account of? Well, "Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal?" You say that it's wrong to steal. Do you steal? You know, not a one of us in this audience, I would think, would go. We wouldn't go into a service station with a knife, would we? Would we go into a service station with a knife and go hold it at the cashier's throat and say, "Give me the money in your register"? We obviously would know that was wrong. Well, you say, well, that's obviously a very big example, but what about breaking into someone's house? Would any of us do that? Would we break into someone's house and take a few things that were there? I'd like to think that none of us would do that. We know that that is wrong. And so we say you shouldn't steal. Don't do that, you people who do those things. But how many of us, if we were to turn on our computers right now, how many of us have stolen pirated movies and music on them? Things that we've gotten illegally. We've been going around garage sales, and it's actually quite common to go around to these garage sales, and you look at this, and I picked up a copy of Aladdin, and I flipped it to the back, and it said PG-13. And I said to myself, there's no way that Aladdin, I don't care who you are, there's no way that Aladdin is PG-13. And we looked at some of the little things that were written there, and it was obviously a pirated copy. All right? Perth is close to Bali, it's close to Indonesia, it's close to Thailand, and all these places. And you go up there, and you see all these movies that are on sale, and oh man, that's like 50 cents. And you bundle up a bag of them, and you bring them home. Well, you're supporting thievery. Those people who've made those things, they've stolen from the producers of these movies. When you download music, you've stolen from the people who have produced this music, and you say, well, they've got plenty of money. They don't need more money. It's not about what they need or don't need. It's a principle. It's a way of living. It's a way of living where you don't take from others what belongs to them. You don't steal from people. It's a Christian behavior. And so we say it's wrong, but do we apply it consistently to our lives? The same goes with these other questions here. In verse 22, you say that a man should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? You know, none of us, hopefully, I know that there's this big, Perth is in the top 25 of the Ashley Madison League, apparently. The top 25 of participants. There are some, what was the number they gave, 85 or 90,000 people in Perth who were signed up to this cheating website. All these government things, all these government emails being found, I think some of that's probably fake. But at the same time, that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people to be participating in this. And so, yeah, that's there happening. But hopefully the people in this room, hopefully we all have said, well, I'm going to be committed to my spouse. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to commit adultery. But men, how many of us have been guilty of, being Hillary's or being somewhere where people are modestly dressed and we kind of do one of these as they're walking around. We stare. And what's happening in our hearts as we stare? Well, adultery is taking place in our hearts because we're looking at what doesn't belong to us and what we have no right to, what belongs to someone else. And that's true of men, but it's also true of women. It happens both ways, but it's not okay. Jesus said that to lust after another person in your heart is the same as committing adultery. If it's there in your heart, it might as well be there in your behavior. Because given the opportunity, if it's there in your heart, you'll do it. Right? And we are people who don't want to live our lives like that. We want to be people who are committed to our spouse. And people who uphold, the rights of ourselves and the rights of others. You see in verse 22, you abhor, you hate idols. Do you commit sacrilege? Literal rendering of that is, and some of your Bibles might read that, do you rob temples? Do you steal from temples? And this was actually a term that people used in those days to refer to people who didn't have the proper respect for divinity. They called them temple robbers, based upon the picture of someone who would break into an idolatrous temple and steal a golden statue just because it was gold. Obviously, he doesn't have respect for the one that honors. And so, in reference to these Jews, well, they're not going to break into temples, but what are they perhaps doing? Maybe they're robbing God in their sacrifice, in their contribution on Sunday. Maybe they're robbing God of the respect that is due to Him, because just like everybody else, they're saying, "Oh my God." They're using His presence and His name in a nothing way. And on we could go in looking at these points. But again, just going down to verse 24, notice what happens when we don't behave in a way that's consistent with our calling. In verse 24 it says, "The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written." The name of God is blasphemed when we behave in an inconsistent way. People think less of our God when we behave in a way that's not in keeping with His truth. And so we want to stop reproach. Give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully. It says in 1 Timothy 5:14, a principle to live by. Live in a way to provide all things honest in the sight of men, and not to do anything that you'd ever have to wonder, boy, was that a good thing? Was that a right thing? We ought to live confidently as a part of our lives, to stop reproach. A second reason is to show reverence. To show reverence. As I said, that slide before was not right. But to show reverence is a reason why Nehemiah personally did not want to see the Jews be a part of this, and why he didn't do it himself as a ruler. Nehemiah was a ruler, realized that even though he's been commissioned by the Persian government to rebuild these walls, he's been given a position of honor. And he actually is able to offer commands, and apparently he'd been given some authority to even exact taxes as a part of his work. He is called the governor of Judah. Whether that was a temporary title given to him or something that was permanent, we see that by the time he's actually written chapter 5, it's about 12 years on. And so he seems to have held this position for some period of time. So he's the governor of Judah, certainly has the right to exact taxes, has the right to take money from the people he's over. But how did he behave himself? He could have taxed the people. In verse 10 he said, "I likewise and my brethren, my servants, we might exact of them, we might tax them money and corn. I pray you let us leave off this usury, this taxation." Why did he not do it? Why did he not do what all the other rulers were doing and what he had the right to do? Well, because he knew it wasn't the right thing to do. He knew that people weren't able to pay these taxes, and he knew the circumstances that the other Jews were putting their Jewish brethren in to do this. We find that not only did he not take taxes, but we find amazingly that in this time of famine, he actually gave generously. In verse 17, we find that 150 of the Jews and rulers came to his dinner every single day. Janet provides a meal on Thursday night for about 15 folks or so. Lena provides a meal on Sunday for about the same. And that's generous. But think about, as a family, any one of us, 150 people that we feed regularly, constantly. Well, that's what he did during this time period, because he realized people were needy. He had to give, and so he gave. He took care of the rulers so that they wouldn't have to draw taxes from the people for them to take care of these rulers. So he does all of these things. Why does he do it? Well, the reason is given in verse 15. It says here, "The former governors that had been before me were chargeable unto the people." They taxed the people just like any government would. "Had taken of them bread and wine, besides 40 shekels of silver. Yea, even their servants bear rule over the people." So the rulers taxed the people. Their servants also taxed the people and ruled over them. "But I did not do so." Why? What does it say? Because of the fear of God. I was living out of respect for God. And I knew that this is not what God would want me to do. We ought to have a proper respect for God. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 29. Our God is a consuming fire. He's an awesome, all-powerful, all-present being. And of course, He is a God of love and compassion, but He's also that consuming fire who does not want to see evil or wickedness being practiced or being a part of people's lives. Knowing that, we hold Him in proper respect. Would I do this if Christ were with me? It's a good question to ask ourselves sometime, just to stop. Before I turn on that television program, before I go to that movie, before I withhold myself from this church event or that worship service or whatever it is, just pause and stop and say, would I do this if Jesus were here with me? You know, he said in Matthew 28:20, I am with you always. We think about that as a promise of comfort. But think about it the other way. He's with you always. Would you do it if he were with you? Would you be showing respect? The last reason that he gives as to why he wanted his conversation to be different than those of the world around him. Nehemiah wanted to secure a reward for himself. In Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 19, he did what he did because he was acting with the knowledge that someone was watching. In verse 19 it says, think upon me, my God, for good, according to all that I've done for this people. He's calling God to think about what he did. Well, the thing is for us, if we haven't done anything, if we don't make any sacrifices, if we don't live any differently, if we behave as everyone else behaves, well, what will God remember? He'll have nothing to remember. We want to be remembered by God. We want to spend our eternity in his home. And so we need to perhaps give up our homes at times. Be generous, be hospitable. We need at times to inconvenience ourselves, to not steal, or we need to change the way that we talk or the way that we dress, so that we behave in a way that says very clearly and plainly to the world that we are Christ's and that we are serving him. As we think about this lesson, I want you to consider the story of a man who went to preach in the city of Sodom, obviously before it was destroyed. Those who are not familiar with the Bible record, Sodom and Gomorrah were two very, very wicked cities that ended up meeting their end because of their wickedness. The story, though, is told of a man who went to Sodom, and he went there trying to preach to them and trying to change them. He goes there, and every single day he puts up his little box, as they did in those days, and he stands on the box, and he begins to preach a lesson, calling them to change, calling them to behave differently. And every single day he was mocked, he was ridiculed, people insulted him, people made fun of him, trying to get him to stop and trying to discourage him. But he does it every single day, day after day, going up there and standing on that box and preaching and proclaiming God's message. Someone finally says to him, why are you doing this? Wasting your time. Why would you even bother to even say anything at all? And the man says, well, I began doing this because I wanted to change them. I began doing this because I saw the way that they were and I wanted them to behave differently. But I keep doing it because I don't want them to change me. I keep doing it because I don't want their life to become my life. We need to be vocally different, visually different. We need to be living in a way that upholds God's name in front of people. To live a life of generosity, to live a life of consistency. We say what we do and we do what we say. That's what God's people ought to be doing and saying. Has the world changed us, or are we changing the world? I want us, as we think about a goal for this lesson, I want us to just simply think, is there something in my behavior that is not consistent with the name of the God that I'm calling upon? I saw a few knowing glances. Usually we get that when we talk about the DVD movies and all of that stuff. There's this, obviously, literally, we've been going to garage sales to buy all this baby stuff, and it'd be rare where there was a garage sale where we weren't seeing these things on sale. And again, it's just a small thing, but it's a big thing, all right, because it's a principle. I remember that time. I grew up in the days in the U.S. Have you ever heard of Napster or LimeWire? Any of these? The file sharing programs, anyway. Napster and LimeWire. I used to have these programs. I used to have a stack. Back in those days, you would burn it onto CDs, a stack of music that I downloaded for free, didn't pay for. And what happened when I actually checked myself? I took that big stack of CDs and I snapped them in half and I threw them away. I had to go back and buy all of those CDs, the ones that were worth buying at least. I bought them all again, legitimately. All right? It's not a fun thing to do. I already had it. What do I need to buy it again for? Well, it's the honest thing to do. And it's what I believe God would have us to do, to be consistent with what we do in our message and our behavior. Conversation. If you have any needs this morning to make your conversation, make your manner of life right with God, let's take care of it. We can do this after services. If you're new here and if you'd like to examine what it takes to become a Christian, to have a manner of life that's going to point you on that road to heaven, we want to talk about that. We'd love to share with you out of the book of Acts how it is that a person can become a Christian. If you have any other needs, though, if we can pray for you, if we can help you in any way, let's think about those things. And if you have any needs, please let us know. We're going to stand now and we're going to sing a song of invitation. You can let us know during the song or after.
Let's stand. I am thine.